Welcome back to the Why I Am Not series. This episode is going to be a little different than some of the last ones. You may have noticed that there are visuals in this one. Well, there are visuals in all of my Why I Am Not series, but they're usually just slides of my points about talking why I am not some denomination. But in this episode, I want to do something a little different. Part of it is I don't have the same 5 points like I usually do for lots of my other series episodes in the series. So I didn't want to do the PowerPoint element. And this one's going to be a little bit more of a long form story anyway. So I figured you might as well be able to look at me while I'm talking to you. So this episode might also seem strange because it's not ostensibly about why I am not a religious denomination or specifically a Christian denomination. Instead, this video is about why I'm not a socialist. The difference between this video and many of my other videos is that I actually have been a socialist before. Some people, if they've watched my testimony video or have had a long form conversation with me, I may have brought up that in the past, when I was in high school especially, I was a Marxist for a couple years. And I can talk about why, and I'll get into all of that in a second. But so part of this is also a story about what I believed, why I stopped believing it, and what kind of took me out. So buckle in, get some tea or coffee or something, or plug your headphones in as you walk some long walk that you are going to listen to this episode in, because this one will probably be longer than normal. All right, okay. The way that I think is worth starting this is basically my journey into politics, if that makes sense, in general. So I would say I became an atheist shortly after what was my bar mitzvah, or actually before my bar mitzvah. Stopped believing in religion in a serious way and started to kind of mature. When you get into high school and you start thinking about the world and how the world works, you still need a framework. So especially if you don't have a religious framework, I think especially guys who like thinking a lot about deep or big ideas or things like that drift towards politics and like thinking about politics and asking different political questions and all these other kinds of things, as well as there's a little bit of identity in it. So, I would have conversations with people in my high school who had very poorly formed political opinions because, they're all 14 or whatever. And I think I probably immaturely, but of course I was also 14, took a little bit of pleasure in having thought out the issues more than they did, and saying, well, have you considered this? Well, have you considered that? And you can kind of get into the like owning phase of political rhetoric. And I definitely thought about it a lot more than most of the people that I knew. But then even if I found somebody who hadn't thought about it more than me, I'd have an intellectually engaging back and forth that I also tended to really enjoy. And so whereas I started as a kind of generic liberal, basically, because I think that was the default perspective in the kind of, northeastern public school that I went to, with a lot of the basic assumptions of kind of Democratic Party mainstream liberalism. I would say, especially looking back on it now, what I was kind of tempted to do in these kinds of arguments, and I think you can actually see this in a lot of political commentators right now, or whatever you want to call them, like people like Destiny, or just in general, I think that the polarization that's going on. But part of that, in my opinion, comes down to the fact that you, in an argument, rather than in an actual implementation of policy, you're compelled to be as consistent with your values and principles as possible, even if that ends up creating regrettable positions. And I think that there is a something people admire in the fact when somebody is very consistent. And I think there's something correct to that, but it can get you into extreme positions, right? Because in order to be dogmatically for any principle, you'd have to. It could take you to uh, uh, strenuous, distant, far off arguments. So I think I basically took all of the received values of my time: equality, liberty of conscience. Um, uh, you know, I would say even the democratic principle that the majority of people benefiting is better than a minority of people benefiting. And I would say I also accepted the idea that history is a constant story of progress towards superior intellectual positions. And basically got to the point where I remember literally thinking to myself, well, okay, if the history of humanity, basically as I'd received it, was the constant progress of left-wing causes over right-wing causes, and the left-wing causes were always the good guys, like without exception, why not just be as left-wing as possible? So something else I noticed, I was already getting into like American history, right? But almost all of the people that we admire now from history tended not to be the people who were moderate voices for moderation and support, but instead radical reformers pushing for things that people at their time thought were crazy. Say abolitionists, women's suffrage, um, uh, civil rights, a lot of these causes that basically were the narrative of progress in history that as I understood it, were portrayed as being good guys. And then if you actually look into the history of these characters, they're very radical most of the time. A lot of the time, these people, John Brown is another example in abolition, they were very violent people. They were very uncompromising people. Women suffragettes did also have, violent protests at times. They starved themselves and did big shows of their, kind of what do you call it? Like for their political cause, big things that were shocking to most people. And I even often found out that they weren't actually that popular if you go through history. I remember distinctly reading, even so, aside from those more popular topics of social change, I remember reading about in the early a debate in the early history of the American Republic between people who were for universal male suffrage and people who were arguing against that in favor of propertied suffrage. So basically, in early American states, for the most part, you actually had to own land to vote. And then they had debates on whether or not to extend it. And eventually, all of the states went with everybody who is, free man can vote in elections. And some states permitted women under certain circumstances, and some states permitted free black men. Some did not permit free black men to vote. And reading the debate, which was basically one stance that I think everyone at the time, even if you just read it, would understand if you had the kind of what I would later come to understand as the Whig view of history as a futile stance, right? Why would you argue against the extension of rights to more people? It was very confusing to me that people were arguing just for property intentions. This were basically the villains of this story. But none of the people involved, and I could say this now, were arguing from a basis of what I would have considered, um, acceptable discourse. I remember thinking that even the conservative interlocutors that I would debate with were really just defending the liberal position from 20 or 30 years ago. So anyway, I started drifting more and more to the left, but in doing so, I wanted to have a respectable position, that wasn't just whatever is as left as possible is correct. And so I started reading a lot of the more leftist literature. So I read Karl Marx. I read Rosa Luxemburg. I really liked, basically, I started drifting into socialism proper, like the ideology of socialism that's based in Marxism. I would say the early stage, I was what's called a revisionist, or not a revisionist. I was a reformist. If you know the splits within socialism, there's the reformists who believe that socialism would kind of come about naturally through parliamentary democracy and capitalism, and that there wasn't necessarily going to have to be some kind of violent revolution. And then split on the other direction would have been Leninists or eventually Stalinists. All the more vanguardist is another term for this. There are other deviations in this and very niche belief systems along the way. And so I went from being democratic socialism. I got very into the Bernie Sanders campaign that was happening at the time, and just kept drifting lefter and lefter and lefter until, well, and it's interesting because what do we mean by left and right? Something that's fascinated me in recent years is, and since then actually, is when I say something is left wing and somebody else says something is right wing, what do we actually mean by that? Like, we can even anticipate future debates in society that we're not currently having, and we would still be able to successfully project onto those issues the left wing, right wing scale. An example that I would give you, and somebody can protest me on this if they believe this is not fair, but I think most people would agree. Imagine we were debating in the future whether or not, uh, um, you know, sexual relationships with animals are acceptable. And I understand that that's not the current left wing position. But if there were two parties that were, one was arguing that sexual relationships with animals were correct, bestiality, and the other one was arguing that it wasn't okay and that we can't do that, it's obvious to anyone who's candidly looking at this that which side is the left wing side, which one is the right wing side. Um, and so I started to take actually even more and more progressively, um, expansive, liberty focused, rights based language focused positions until I was just um, a actually at a certain point a Leninist. Because what happens, I think, in this train of thought is, again, like I said earlier, why not be as left wing as possible? Why not advocate as radically for change if the grand scheme of history is ultimately progressing towards that anyway? And do you want to be vindicated in the future, or do you want people to look back at you as a compromiser and that um, and quite frankly, the word that would have been used was a liberal, right? Socialists use the word liberal in a negative way as well to talk about people to the right of them or more moderate left wingers, and use it derisively as people who are too cowardly or too comfortable to advocate for what they know is correct. I think it's Malcolm X who basically said that he likes conservatives more than he likes liberals, because at least conservatives are unafraid to argue for what they believe in, while liberals occupy the horrible middle space of saying some evil is okay, but only some good is permissible. Too much good would be bad, basically, which they don't admire. And I was the same way. And I'd get into long debates with people in my high school about these positions. I started writing for my high school newspaper, and I had a lot of my what I was writing, not like the editor of the journal did not permit me to publish it because it was so radical, I think. But very pro immigration, anti-borders, lots of these positions, and then just whatever the most radical position. Because I think also at a certain point, you start to be disillusioned with the concept of democratic rights, or the democratic correctness, I should say, not rights as in like the Declaration of Human Rights, but right as in being you are correct. Because why on earth, and this is an odd position, why on earth is it actually that 51% of people vote, and then that is the correct, morally correct position? I was much more comfortable with looking at the grand arc of history, anticipating where that would end up ultimately, and assigning that as being the correct eventual position, and saying that was right. And so if there was some revolutionary vanguard party that was going to make that progress more tangibly and successfully, then obviously they would be correct. Now, usually in my testimony, the way that I talk about this part is that this is what, like, my descent into depression started with these things, because it's a more bleak worldview. It really is. That it's basically the world is a struggle between different groups of power, which I wouldn't necessarily categorically disagree with, but that those power groups are suppressing vulnerable working class people or minorities as well. And the only real way you start to think that this would ever reverse itself, this horrid state of affairs will reverse itself, would be through violence. Then you start to fixate and ideate, and I did this as well. And I know lots of people who do the same thing, that you'll be the hero of that, revolutionary accomplishment someday, and then you'll be on the right side of history. And so, at its core, I think what is being built up is this kind of mythology or a revolutionary state that approximates, in my opinion, a religion. And I'm not the first person to say this, and I'm not going to be the last person. And it's really not that important. But basically, you have an eschatology, right? A teleology, how the world's going to end, right? We're currently in the, you could say like the second age in some mythos, right? So the first stage was feudalism, or actually, I think in Marxism, right, it goes hunter-gatherers, first age, second age, you get all these different class antagonism periods. Anyway, and then capitalism is the current class antagonism, and it will be replaced by a socialist society, which would naturally be the resolution to the history's unique story of struggle between classes. So what did trouble me, though, and I think troubles most Marxists, even if they don't admit it, was the obvious fact that most self-proclaimed Marxist revolutions do not end up resulting in the prophesied, state, right? It's much like, I think, actually, if you look at the history of Israel in the 1st and 2nd century, where you have all of these false messiahs who do promise the Jews' version of the Holy Land and the restored kingdom of Israel, like Simon Bar Kokhba, if you look him up, it ends up just getting worse, actually. So you think you have this Messiah or revolution or whatever that's going to bring about this prophesied state, and then it doesn't. It's a failure. I got obsessed with Roman history and all these historical periods, and you can see similar themes in, say, the Spartacus revolt or all these other slave revolts where they actually end up becoming horrible tyrannies. And the same thing happens in like Florence, and then the French Revolution, and then the Russian Revolution, infamously, the Chinese Revolution. Started studying them very in depth, and I think what I was hoping was that we would be able to study these periods well enough and kind of counter the faults that were inherent in those circumstances to actually bring about a socialist state rather than the failures that actually ended up happening. And I would have said that the Soviet Union wasn't as much of a failure as people put it out to be, and there were lots of discrepancies, but I would have admitted that, like, Stalin was bad. And I remember got kicked off of a Reddit forum for making fun of what are called tankies, or people who support Stalin in socialist communities. But I was a socialist, so, like, it wasn't like I was getting kicked off because I was some conservative or something, but I got kicked off because I was ridiculing Stalin. There's kind of left communism as well, right? So Trotsky is another fan of these people. If only Trotsky had come into power, it would have been a much more democratic society, I guess, is the assumption. But, if you actually just look at Lenin's rule, and he was supposed to be this fabled positive hero as well, there really wasn't some democratic structure. There was rule by the party bosses and the party elite, which in a vanguardist mindset isn't horrible, because think about it like this. In a bourgeois republic, which we live in now, right, which is capitalism, parliamentary democracy, whatever, there's a nominal rule by the majority in a democracy, but then in effect, the upper classes benefit in the Marxist mind, right? So the reverse could be true as well, right? So there's no democratic institutions in the Soviet Union, say, but it's still towards the benefit of the proletariat, at least in theory. And that's where you get the idea of like a proletarian dictatorship, yada, yada, yada. Okay. And didn't really like that, and I favored what's a position called syndicalism. And you can see certain other socialist figures like Tito, who were in favor of things like market socialism. And I wondered, really what could be done to actually, and I rejected the kind of vanguardism. What could actually be done in a serious way to create an institution for socialism to actually exist in a meaningful way? It was clear to me, too, just from studying history, that no new economic situation had actually arisen from some kind of political revolt. That became clear to me. I think I believed that for a long time, but then, just again, looking at history, it just didn't seem like that was what happened. Which, by the way, Marx believed that was the case. He didn't think that there would be this vanguard party. He didn't believe in Leninism. Leninism is based off of Marxism. He believed it would be kind of a natural consequence of the contradictions in capitalism. He appealed to Marx, and he appealed to Hegel, and the idea of dialectical materialism, and yada yada yada. And so I believe that definitely more than I believe that in a way that still wasn't a reformist. So lots of the socialist reformists, so like labor parties or whatever, agreed that socialism was inevitable, but they did not believe in a political revolution. They just thought, in the same way Marx did, that it would eventually come about through social slow change and reform. The problem with this is, though, however, is the kind of third worldism question. So if you actually study socialist revolutions, and it's pretty obvious anybody, they don't seem like they actually occur in fully developed capitalist countries or succeed in fully developed capitalist countries. In the early 20th century, there was like a Bavarian commune and a Hungarian commune and a you know, commune, all these things in maybe more developed capitalist countries, but they were quickly suppressed. So there's a position within socialism called third worldism, which basically says that when societies are actually on the cusp of feudalism or like an agrarian economy and capitalism, they have this vulnerable new moment where they can actually choose to instead become a socialist country like China, or Burkina Faso is another example that a lot of people like to use in this period. Um, and but I also didn't agree with that, because that is a kind of revisionism. Revisionism ends up being used in a different way, but really the original Marxist position was that capitalism has to precede communism. It doesn't work the other way around, and I believe that. Um, and I could point to the fact that all these third world revolutions were much more dictatorial. They didn't have all the civil liberties that I still valued as a socialist. That was supposed to be the point of socialism, right? That there would be this general prosperity and economic prosperity, as well as civil liberties and all these kinds of things. But it did seem like it wasn't happening in the first world in the same way that it would happen in the so-called third world. And you could look at different movements and all these things, but still, the idea that there weren't really any successful true Marxist societies that followed that chain of being really bothered me, really bugged me. I think I recognize the idea that saying, "Oh, that wasn't real socialism," to people who disagree with socialism was a poor retort. Not being able to produce any society with your ideology actually played itself out is a problem, and saying you liked it, right? Because I imagine, there are some horrid ideologies that we would all agree were bad, but then if the supporter grants that is the horrid outcome is exactly what they desired, then that's still a logically consistent position to hold. But it wasn't a very logically consistent position to hold, to believe in something that didn't really seem like it was going to happen. And so I think what the position that I started to approach was what made successful revolutions work. Because again, in my mind at the time, I think I would have still thought of revolutions as a positive thing. And basically the only thing I could tell was that there had to actually be existing power groups who were not displaced to create a power vacuum that were maintained through the revolution. So say like the American Revolution, there were already American patriot landowners who owned lots of wealth and were powerful in these local legislatures. And so when they seceded from Britain, they didn't have to replace all of these institutions. They got to keep them, and that maintained a level of stability. And I would say basically that's the history of all of the successful nationalist movements. So it definitely does seem like there are independence wars that are oftentimes called revolutions that are more likely to result in a stable after war period. And that's because there's the domestic institutions of whatever that country are that just take over from the colonial government. Still, though, when there aren't local institutions that are comparable, there's a lot of instability in those independence revolts as well. And democracy usually does not result from a period of instability. That was something I was able to recognize. So the ultimate realization that I had was two. Well, I had two ultimate realizations. One was I began to be disillusioned with the idea that hierarchy was bad. When I was a socialist, the idea is that equality, people's equality is obvious. And I think actually there's a fair argument there, right? People being equal in dignity, especially in our modern Western society, is a presumption that we all just make today. And so why shouldn't our social systems reflect the equality of dignity of all men? And then why should we reward some men over others with, say, material wealth? The way we organize our society definitely incentivizes different behaviors over others. It wasn't until I started to read Nietzsche that I started to think, okay, well, actually, there is some value in incentivizing certain things we consider virtues with our economic system. Now, I still would have thought capitalism was very bad at this, and I would have thought um, basically what capitalism does is it just rewards people who are the most shrewd, but shrewdity isn't really a virtue in any meaningful sense. I was getting really into reading aesthetics. That was because I started reading Slavoj Žižek, if anyone knows who Žižek is. And these ascetic characters, and lots of them are Christian, actually, material needs, and they were still very clearly virtuous people. So I started to get a little bit more into kind of asceticism as a value system, right? Because then you can say, okay, well, actually, an even worse element of socialist revolutions is they often leave people completely poor and destitute. And I started to be entertain the idea, okay, well, that's not necessarily bad, right? Why should we have material wealth? Like, is that a morally virtuous thing to have? And shouldn't we reward people who actually have moral virtues over people who don't? And even most socialist societies, especially the actual socialist societies, rather than Tumblr ideologies, acknowledge that there are like criminals that we should punish. And when you punish a criminal for a certain behavior, you're creating a hierarchy between law-abiding citizens and non-law-abiding citizens. And you can either reject that concept, which many more postmodern thinkers do. And I never got into that kind of postmodern space as well. I would say my Marxism was thoroughly modernist, if that category means anything to you. So then you start to realize, okay, there is kind of a necessary hierarchy here. And then if in my opinion, if you actually read some of the more astute kind of Soviet thinkers, they thought of the Soviet system as having a hierarchy of virtues. And they talked a lot about the new Soviet man and athletes being exemplary characters, virtuous workers over non-virtuous workers, right? And civil servants who were noble, who deserved reward over people who needed to be penalized. And so there's still a hierarchy there, right? But it's not really egalitarianism anymore. And I think in the same way that when I had previously assumed all of these principles that I had received from the culture and then taken them to their logical conclusions, in my opinion, and that had turned me into a socialist, as my principles and ideas were changing, that was when I started to lose my kind of socialist orthodoxy, if that makes sense. Because then you start to say, okay, well, then hierarchy is not bad. It's actually good, but we need to have a rightly ordered hierarchy. Well, what did rightly ordered hierarchies look like? And then, certain people didn't even need to be rewarded to exemplify virtues like ascetics, monks, all these kinds of people. So maybe the system that was going to come after capitalism, which I still believe capitalism was kind of on its way out, right? Maybe that wasn't Marx's idea of this classless society, where there's no more class and where there's no more class distinctions. Maybe there would still be a society that didn't have class antagonism, but still had some kind of hierarchy of social order. It would be necessary to do so. Maybe human nature required such a thing to exist. Started reading like Plato's Republic and some of these older thinkers and realized that political idealism was basically written into Western society. We constantly had all of these ideologies that motivated the thought processes that resulted in society. Okay, so that was the first kind of change, was on that. The second thing that started to take me out of the socialist perspective was the realization, and I kind of hinted at this as well, is that the socialist presuppositions of history are not necessarily correct. So, whereas I was able to recognize that the diagnoses maybe of capitalism's ills were fair, that the Marxists were able of making, that didn't actually mean any of their predictions were correct. And I started to realize lots of people have made lots of predictions that haven't come true. And you have to be able to parse through the variety of claims being made from all of the people involved to actually discern who is actually good at predicting the future, because that's actually much rarer than somebody who's able to accurately describe the present or the past, which is exactly what Marx did. So you can start by thinking, okay, one of the books that I read that was very influential, that I'm rereading recently, which is what inspired this video, is called The Managerial Revolution by James Burnham. It's an interesting book. It's got some wacky ideas in it as well. But basically, he points out in the third chapter or something, that while he might agree that capitalism is on its way out, he basically diagnosed World War I as the end of capitalism in his definition, which is an interesting thought process on its own. Maybe I'll do another video about Burnham's ideology. It's actually not granted, though, that when capitalism is on its way out, it'll be replaced by socialism, and that a lot of presuppositions were being made by Marxists that kind of fed into their worldview. So I would say I basically started to realize, like, hold on, people have to actually base what they're doing off of reality rather than off of ideology, and ground themselves more and more in reality. And that is the nobility in a kind of reform position, right? So whereas before I was talking, okay, why would you be a reformer because instead of revolutionary? Because in theory, if there's some objective morality that you've all identified, reformers are just the compromisers, and the revolutionaries are the ones who actually hold to the principles. But if you read, it's interesting because Burke talks about this. Edmund Burke talks about the idea that a real kind of traditionalist, in some sense, position is, oh, okay, well, yes, some people will come up with new ideas that are good. Most ideas won't be good. So we'll need to have some kind of method of continuing what we know works, which is what's currently in existence, and slowly modifying it. Now, in my opinion, actually, Edmund Burke is basically just a Whig. I think he literally was a Whig politician, which was the Liberal Party in Britain at the time, who was able to look at the French Revolution, which is what he was commenting on, and recognize, okay, when they threw out all of the institutions, it became total power vacuum and chaos, and the strongest men come to the top, not the most principled men. So reform is the best way to actually achieve the progressive aims of, say, the French Revolution. But I think the underlying tension there is that it still concedes the principles of the revolution in a way by saying that, right? It still concedes that what the French revolutionaries were trying to do was actually good. But the question that was now ailing me were those principles actually good? Or were they the kind of vain aspirations of people who wanted to be the main character, basically, which is, I was able to recognize in myself. I started thinking back, okay, all of these fantasies about, revolution that I was having were kind of really just about being the main character, being in this monumental moment. All of the history that I had learned from, say, my public school were of these monumental victories for civil rights in some kind of way. And there's almost no other narrative in which a person could find any self-worth growing up in that context. And so even if there weren't civil rights issues, the only way that a sane person who had accepted that narrative could continue to find meaning in his own life would be to accept that there always will be a struggle for civil rights, and that I have to solve the problems for civil rights to have value and meaning. And what that led to, I started to realize, were people basically inventing civil rights crises to be the heroes of, in some sense. I started to get a little bit more cynical about actual politics, and realized, again, through my genuine desire to see socialist revolution accomplished, and through studying history in an attempt to do that, that really what ends up happening is whatever the situation incentivizes to happen, not really what is ideologically promised at the beginning of any system. So feudalism was an economic condition that summoned an ideological explanation, i.e. divine right monarchy, the golden chain of being, all these other kinds of things. Capitalism did the same, actually, although very poorly, in my opinion. It's much more short-lived and less capable of producing a coherent ideology to support its own economic structure. And socialism would in theory have to do that as well. It would have to be the ideology that fed into some economic reality. And I began to realize that it kind of was doing that in capitalism. And so, really, the economic conditions that create the ideology of socialism were capitalism, not any yet to be existent place. I started reading George Orwell, who had a very similar disillusionment with socialism. He had been a socialist and then had fought in the Spanish Civil War and had seen the kind of early 20th century failures of socialism and was disillusioned. And something he pointed out is that a lot of times what actually motivates people to be socialists is that they are not working class people. This also bothered me at the time because I knew I was basically a intellectual kind of middle class kid ish, right? Growing up in a Jewish family, right? And really, what was motivating their socialist beliefs was jealousy of people who were better off in the social hierarchy. So you were doing just well enough as a middle class person, have all this free time to read a bunch of books, but also not at the top of the hierarchy enough to kind of defend the status quo. You still were convinced that if there was a big shakeup, you'd end up moving up the ladder. And not for nothing, this seems like actually it was mostly true. If you look at like a lot of the socialist revolutionaries in the Soviet Union or in all of the other revolutions, they usually were kind of middling class people that ended up rising in the chaos. Whether or not they thought that consciously, that was a very real, clear motivation for a lot of this. A lot of the ideology. So again, starting to think about, okay, well, hierarchies reinforce values, so hierarchies are necessarily bad. Okay, and then ideologies are often produced by economic situations, which is related to that hierarchy thing I was thinking about. What actually are good values that we should be promoting as a society? And I realized that I had never in this entire journey actually said, okay, why should I find any particular set of values good or bad? I'd only just assumed all of the things that I already been told, basically, about what was good and what was bad. And in my opinion, the same, um, you know, the way capitalism tends to justify itself is off of material conditions. Look how much better off humanity is because of capitalism. And what socialism uninventively does is takes that and says, okay, but the material conditions should be equal. And I remember thinking, still being very attached to that idea, because I did think it was quite bad that basically I have a system where economically people are incentivized to amass huge fortunes, basically to the detriment of other people by charging them, say you're a business owner, you want to hire people for the lowest wage you can get away with, right? Because that's the economically incentivized thing to do. I didn't think that was right. Okay. So how could we have some kind of hierarchy of morals that would reward people for being good? And then if you really look into start going backwards in philosophical history, I think you start to realize this was the great project of religion. The great project of all religions really was to create instant hierarchies of piety and to actually make them happen. So whether or not you're a Buddhist or a Muslim or a medieval Christian, the hope was that the church and say you're in India, right? This is the Brahmin class, would be like the moral heart of whatever society you live in and incentivize a real moral hierarchy, not just some justification for whatever hierarchy already exists. And this is again where I started to find a lot more sympathy with some of the ascetic people because they were willing to forgive, they would give up a lot of these natural desires for the sake of something greater. So as opposed to the kind of materialist worldview that I was used to in, say, capitalism and socialism, where, people just do whatever is in their best interest, right? Because even in socialism, the conceit is that the working class will desire their own liberation in their own best conditions. A lot of kind of socialist ideologues tend to be frustrated with the fact that working class people don't actually even seem to want socialism. And I think part of that is because of the reality of the situation, which is, and this was the real undoing of, I think, my socialist pretensions, is that meaning matters more to people than comfort. Meaning is a context for yourself. And even in my own socialist journey, I was starting to realize that I had actually only believed what I believed in search of meaning, not out of some economic incentive. And which is the great socialist criticism, by the way, of the capitalists. Oh, everything's all, economic incentives in your capitalist conception of the economy. But that's just not how the world works. And you can actually even read some more, I would say, harrowing figures from, say, the aftermath of the First World War, who really embraced this idea that, basically the Valhalla idea, which has been with humanity for a long time. The idea that if you had some glorious, very meaningful death, then your life was worth living, right? You could suffer and end your life, but as long as it was in this great act of heroism, it would matter. And I think that really puts a wrench, ultimately, in the materialist trajectory of the future. And I think that all of those things combined really ended up unseating what I believed. And what I also ultimately ended up realizing was that people's values come from, in some sense, what their economic conditions incentivize, but that's not always good, and that we need some mechanism to overdo that, and that mechanism has to be inherited or it won't exist. Nobody has ever devised a new system that instantiated itself completely wholesale differently from whatever already existed. So, and we actually, while I was in high school and while I was younger, we were having trouble in the Middle East trying to do just that project, which was take whatever the existing situation in these not democratic Middle Eastern countries and replace them with Western democracies. And it was clearly, obviously impossible to do so because it was not an indigenous system that had a history and a rooted contextualization in that society. And the reverse was true about perceived revolutions in our own society. I remember even thinking of studying more American history and realizing in a lot of ways that the American Constitution was kind of a reversal of the revolutionary spirit of the American Revolution. And many people thought of it that way. Thomas Jefferson thought of the Constitution as revoking a lot of the liberties that had been won by the American Revolution. Taxation ended up being higher in lots of places after the Revolution. The Revolution, in a lot of ways, was founded on the idea of a purely voluntary association. So no man could be compelled by government or loyalty to a government to do things that he did not want. You couldn't tax a person unless he consented to the tax. And the original Articles of Confederation enshrined that into law. No state or person really could be taxed unless they had consented to the tax, which meant that if, 12 out of the 13 colonies voted to have a new tax, or 13 states in their Articles of Confederation voted to have a new tax, the 13th state, which did not vote for it, would not have the tax. And so then what ends up happening is none of the parties want to vote for it because they don't want to be taxed in a way that will benefit someone who's not being taxed. And so they had to impose in the Constitution new powers to the federal government, which ended up countering a lot of the ideals of the American Revolution in favor of what? Was it some arbitrary system of government? No, it was a system of government very much like the British system, which had been complained about for 20 years. And it had three branches: an executive, which was the monarch in Britain, but also the president in the United States; a legislative branch, which is bicameral, right? Which was a controversy at the time with some appointed senators, right? So in the original Constitution, senators were picked by their states rather than being voted on directly. And a judicial branch, which is independent. All of these branches were independent, and I would be the last person to point out how similar this is to the British Constitution. And so again, people who actually meaningfully set up any system that succeeds had to look to the past to get the bearings for that new system. And so that began my journey into conservatism and being more conservative. And I found lots of like-minded people who had previously been socialists, who were disillusioned by socialism and ended up in the conservative movement. And I found out it was actually very common intellectual journey for lots of people. Thomas Sowell was someone I started reading a lot of, and he was a very similar journey. Um, the I believe the Dawkins. No, I'm getting the name wrong. Hitchens, Christopher Hitchens, or one of those guys. Very similar story. One of the Hitchens brothers, where they were socialists and became more conservative. You can find lots of historical figures that this is basically their journey. And I would say Kissinger is kind of similar, but although he was always more cynical. Orwell, like I pointed out before, who used to be very socialist, kind of drifted off. Anyway, started to be able to admire the actual lived reality and traditions and systems that actually existed over the kind of ideological preconceptions that were produced by thinkers in some university somewhere, where the university people who are writing and theorizing end up being the amazing heroes in the end, because they're the ones who realize the eschatology of the system. So it's like it's like if people made up Christianity, but Jesus or the savior character was actually whatever political class or intellectual class they were already a part of. And you can see how I think it's easy to be disillusioned when you start to realize that your little pet political project is actually just the consequence, just as much as any other political project, of economic incentives and of self-aggrandizement and egoism and the need for meaning, really. That was really the mix combination. Then I would start reading other economics guys like Veblen, if anyone knows who Veblen is, Max Weber, who wrote The Protestant Work Ethic, and started to realize, okay, there's actually this kind of weird interplay between social needs and the economy and meaning and ideology affecting the material conditions, while the material conditions affect the ideology. And it's a kind of more complicated cycle than than any ideologist can predict. And started to realize that the real great divide in political worldviews, or even say theological worldviews, right, was you either accept a received tradition that has been already lived out, to which you can point to it as evidence of being successful or not successful, or you devise your own completely wholesale ideology from the ground up, and even when it has been tried and has failed, you can kind of reject it. Which ended up leading me down to the question of, okay, well, Christian civilization has been tried, and has it been successful? And I definitely didn't have the same struggles I had with socialism on that front, I think. But that's a question for another time. I actually kind of have a video already about that called The Best Argument for Christianity, the Argument from History, that I think is worth watching if you're interested in that. Otherwise, if you liked this video, be sure to like it. If you want to hear more about my journey with socialism and maybe more about politics, I'd be interested. I have a lot of earlier videos actually about more political, socio-cultural stuff that I kind of want to do more of. But I find doesn't get as much attention as some of my more theological stuff, which is fine. But I'd be interested in doing that if people want to see more of me talking about politics. Yeah, and if you want to support me, you can always support me over at younganglican.locals.com. If you haven't already, you should check out anglicanrenaissance.org to get connected to the Anglican Renaissance. I think that is speedily progressing. I'll be doing a live stream soon to talk more about that. If you want to listen to Anglican audiobooks, you can now over at Anglican Renaissance Library, and me and some other Anglican YouTubers have recorded some audiobooks that are there available for your listening pleasure. All right. Thank you so much for watching, and God bless.